At 71, John Travolta is not standing beneath bright lights or walking a red carpet. He is standing in silence, in a place where applause no longer reaches and memories speak louder than any crowd. The public story says he is simply slowing down, choosing family, stepping back on his own terms. But those who have watched closely sense something heavier unfolding. This is not the collapse of a career, and it is not a scandal-driven disappearance. It feels more like a man carefully closing doors he once fought desperately to keep open. In recent years, people around him noticed subtle changes that felt unsettling in their quietness. Personal items were given away without explanation. Routines were simplified. Projects were chosen with an almost surgical selectiveness, and words about time and mortality surfaced more often, spoken without fear, but with a calm that suggested acceptance rather than anxiety. For someone who once filled rooms with movement and energy, the stillness felt loud. Hollywood is a place that celebrates reinvention, but it rarely prepares its stars for the weight of accumulated loss. And in his case, loss arrived not once, but repeatedly, carving deep emotional lines long before the world began to worry. From the outside, his life once looked like a fantasy engineered to perfection. Wealth beyond imagination, creative freedom, aviation estates where aircraft rested like extensions of his own body, and a legacy built on roles that defined entire generations. Yet behind that image lived a man who learned early that nothing is permanent. Long before age slowed his pace, grief had already rewritten his priorities. He had spoken in interviews years ago about how fragile life truly is, how anyone could be gone tomorrow, comments that once sounded philosophical but now feel painfully literal. Those words were not performative wisdom. They were lived experience quietly leaking into public view. The death that shaped him did not arrive as distant tragedies. They arrived in his arms, in hospital rooms, in family vacations that turned into lifelong scars. Each time, he returned to the world and continued working, smiling, dancing, performing the role expected of him. But something fundamental shifted after each goodbye. By the time he reached his 70s, the man the audience thought they knew no longer fully existed. The ambition that once drove him had softened into something gentler and far more fragile. Friends describe him as present yet introspective, warm yet withdrawn, deeply devoted to his children, and increasingly detached from the machinery of fame. There is no bitterness in this withdrawal, no anger at Hollywood, only a sense that the cost of staying visible finally outweighed the comfort of staying real. He still loves storytelling, still respects the craft, but the hunger to be seen has faded. What replaced it is a need to protect what remains, to preserve moments that cannot be replayed or res-hot. The idea that he is saying goodbye unsettles people because it forces a confrontation with something uncomfortable. We like our icons eternal, frozen at their peaks, untouched by time or sorrow. His story challenges that illusion. It shows that even the most celebrated lives are measured not by success, but by endurance, not by fame, but by the ability to keep standing after repeated emotional earthquakes. This quiet retreat is not dramatic enough for headlines, yet carries more emotional weight than any scandal ever could. It feels intentional, deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if he is preparing for a final chapter written not for audiences, but for himself and his family. What makes this moment so powerful is that it does not ask for sympathy, nor does it demand attention. It simply exists, quietly, honestly, as the natural outcome of a life lived intensely and painfully in equal measure. At 71, he is not fading away. He is choosing where his energy belongs. And that choice, shaped by love, grief, and survival, tells us more about who he truly is than any role he ever played on screen. The man the world came to admire did not emerge from privilege or ease, but from a childhood shaped by uncertainty, sensitivity, and an almost desperate need to belong. John Travolta grew up in a modest home where money was often a source of tension and stability always felt fragile. His father worked long hours, constantly worried about providing for a large family, while his mother carried dreams far bigger than the walls that surrounded them. She filled the house with music, theater records, and imagined stages, creating an emotional refuge for a boy who struggled to find his place elsewhere. School was not a safe space. His soft voice, his stutter, his gentle nature made him stand out in ways that invited cruelty rather than understanding. Classrooms became places of embarrassment and isolation, moments where silence felt safer than speaking and invisibility felt preferable to attention. At home, everything changed. In front of his siblings, he transformed. He danced, mimicked voices, reenacted scenes he invented on the spot, and for the first time felt in control of how others saw him. Performance was not about applause then, it was about survival. It gave him a language when words failed and confidence when the outside world stripped it away. His mother noticed this instinctively. She did not see a shy child struggling to fit in. She saw a performer searching for a stage. She pushed him gently, but persistently toward community theater, auditions, and lessons, even when finances were tight and the future uncertain. That encouragement became the first real anchor in his life, the belief that there was somewhere he truly belonged. His early experiences on stage were small, but transformative. Community plays, modest roles, unfamiliar audiences sitting only a few feet away. Yet those moments carried an intensity that stayed with him forever. He learned how laughter felt when it was earned, how silence could be held, how emotion could move people without explanation. By the time he reached his teenage years, the decision had already been made internally, long before it was spoken aloud. Staying meant shrinking. Leaving meant risk, but also possibility. At 16, he walked away from home with little more than hope, heading to New York City with no safety net and no guarantees. New York was not kind at first. He slept in cheap shared rooms, took whatever work he could find, washed dishes, delivered flowers, cleaned spaces that reminded him daily how far he still had to go. Auditions were crowded, impersonal, and often humiliating. He waited in lines with dozens of other hopeful faces, each carrying the same dream and the same fear of being forgotten. Rejection was constant, but something in him refused to retreat. Each no reinforced the idea that success was not optional, it was necessary. Failure meant returning to a life where he felt unseen, and that was not something he could accept. When his first meaningful opportunities arrived, they felt almost unreal. Small roles led to slightly bigger ones, and suddenly people began to notice his presence. There was something magnetic about the way he moved, the way he listened, the way emotions seemed to live just beneath the surface. Television opened a door that theater never could. Fame arrived quickly, almost violently, transforming a boy who once tried to disappear into someone everyone wanted to watch. Yet beneath that transformation, the same emotional wiring remained. He was still deeply sensitive, deeply affected by approval and rejection, still carrying the echoes of childhood where belonging had to be earned. That sensitivity became both his greatest strength and his quietest vulnerability. It allowed him to connect with audiences in ways that felt honest and raw, but it also meant he absorbed pressure differently than others. Success did not erase insecurity, it amplified it. Each achievement raised expectations, and each expectation created fear of falling short. Even as his career gained momentum, he remained emotionally tethered to the need for validation, for reassurance that he deserved the space he occupied. Those early years shaped how he approached everything that followed, from fame to love to loss. Understanding this background is essential to understanding the man he would later become. The public often sees the confidence, the swagger, the iconic roles, but underneath lived a person who had learned early that stability could vanish without warning. That lesson never left him. It influenced how deeply he loved, how intensely he worked, and how profoundly he felt pain when life took something away. The foundation of his story is not glamour, it is vulnerability, and that vulnerability would later make the tragedies of his adult life not just devastating, but transformative in ways the audience could not immediately see. The moment that truly connected his past vulnerabilities to his present reality did not arrive as a single dramatic headline, but as a slow accumulation of pain that finally reached a breaking point. For John Travolta, tragedy was not an abstract concept discussed in interviews. It was something that entered his life quietly and then refused to leave. The first wound that never fully healed came early, at a time when success was just beginning to feel real. He was young, emotionally open, and deeply attached to the woman who represented safety and understanding during the most chaotic period of his rise. When illness took her away, the loss was sudden and intimate, happening not behind closed hospital doors, but in his arms. That experience carved into him a permanent awareness that love could vanish without warning, even at the exact moment life seemed to be offering everything else. He returned to work afterward because that was what was expected, because momentum does not pause for grief, but those close to him noticed that something essential had shifted. He smiled when required, showed up when called, yet there was a distance in his eyes that had not existed before. Years later, when family finally gave him a sense of grounding and continuity, tragedy returned in a far more devastating form. Becoming a father was not simply a milestone for him. It was a redefinition of purpose. His children anchored him in a way fame never could. They gave structure to his life beyond sets and schedules, beyond scripts and premieres. That is why the loss of his son did not just break his heart, it fractured his identity. The event itself was sudden, disorienting, occurring in a place meant for rest and togetherness. One moment they were a family on vacation. The next he was confronting the unthinkable. Grief of that magnitude does not announce itself loudly. It settles into the body, alters breathing, changes how time is perceived. He later described it as the worst thing that could happen to a person, and those words were not performative. They were the closest he could come to articulating an experience that resisted language altogether. In the months that followed, his public appearances continued, but something was unmistakably different. His energy softened, his humor became restrained, and moments of silence stretched longer than before. He spoke less about his work and more about family, about presence, about the fragility of ordinary days. Friends recall that he became fiercely protective, not just of his remaining children, but of private moments that once would have been shared freely. Work became secondary, something to be carefully balanced rather than relentlessly pursued. The industry noticed the shift, but did not fully understand it. From the outside, it looked like maturity, like perspective gained with age. From the inside, it was survival. Then came the loss that quietly changed everything again. His partner, the person who had stood beside him through grief, criticism, career fluctuations, and parenthood, was gone. The illness was fought privately, deliberately shielded from public consumption. When she passed, the announcement carried no spectacle, only a few carefully chosen words that revealed how completely his world had narrowed. In that moment, he did something he had rarely done before. He stepped away, not for publicity, not for reinvention, but because staying visible felt incompatible with what his family needed. The decision was immediate and deeply personal. He did not frame it as retirement or withdrawal, but as necessity. His children had lost their mother, and he refused to let them lose their father to obligation as well. This was not the reaction of a man overwhelmed by fame, but someone who had finally reached the limits of endurance. Each loss had stripped away layers of illusion until only what mattered remained. Career achievements no longer carried the same weight. Accolades felt distant, almost irrelevant, compared to the responsibility of being present in moments that could not be recreated. Observers noticed changes that felt symbolic in their simplicity. He reduced commitments, declined projects without explanation, and restructured his life around routines that prioritized stability over exposure. He spent more time at home, more time flying, more time in spaces where silence was allowed. What made this period especially striking was the absence of bitterness. There were no public accusations, no visible resentment toward fate or circumstance. Instead, there was acceptance, a quiet acknowledgement that life had asked more of him than he had ever expected to give. Those who spoke with him during this time described a man who was reflective rather than broken, emotionally open yet deeply guarded. He spoke about time differently, about how quickly it moves and how easily it is wasted. He listened more than he talked. He seemed less interested in being understood by the world and more focused on understanding his own boundaries. This phase of his life represents the emotional center of his story, the point where childhood vulnerability, early loss, fame, and family collided into something irreversible. It explains why later choices appeared drastic to outsiders but felt inevitable to him. The tragedies did not push him away from life. They pulled him closer to it, closer to what remained. In stepping back, he was not retreating from meaning, he was redefining it on his own terms. And it is in this redefining that the quiet goodbye truly begins, not as an ending, but as a deliberate narrowing of focus shaped by grief, love, and an unshakable awareness of how little time is ever guaranteed. The consequences of everything he endured did not explode outward in dramatic fashion. They folded inward, slowly reshaping the way John Travolta moved through the world and related to those around him. Grief does not always announce itself with visible collapse. Sometimes it manifests as restraint, as an intentional narrowing of life to only what feels survivable. After the losses that defined his adulthood, the most noticeable change was not what he said, but what he stopped doing. He became more selective with his time, more guarded with his emotions, and increasingly resistant to anything that felt invasive or unnecessary. The man who once embraced interviews, public appearances, and a relentless rhythm of promotion began to treat visibility as a cost rather than a privilege. Professionally, the shift was subtle but unmistakable. Projects were no longer chosen for scale or prestige, but for emotional safety. He gravitated toward work that allowed him control, shorter schedules, smaller crews, and minimal disruption to his family life. Long-term commitments lost their appeal. The industry interpreted this as a slowing down that naturally comes with age, but those close to him understood it differently. It was not exhaustion, it was prioritization born from pain. He had learned, repeatedly, that time is the one resource that cannot be recovered, and he was no longer willing to trade it away lightly. The psychological impact extended beyond work. Friends noticed that he became deeply present, yet emotionally economical. Conversations felt more intentional, less performative. He listened carefully, often letting silence stretch instead of filling it. There was warmth, but also distance, a protective boundary shaped by years of sudden loss. He had loved deeply and lost profoundly, and that history made him cautious about emotional exposure. Not withdrawn, but measured. He showed affection freely with his children, yet limited the number of people allowed into that inner circle. Trust became something earned slowly, not assumed. Socially, his world grew smaller. Large gatherings, industry events, and public celebrations no longer held the same appeal. Instead, he favored environments where routine offered comfort. Familiar spaces, familiar faces, predictable rhythms. Flying, once a passion rooted in freedom and control, evolved into something more meditative. It became a space where he could think without interruption, where grief could exist without observation. In the cockpit, he was not an icon or a symbol. He was simply present, focused, grounded in the moment. That sense of control mattered deeply to someone whose life had been repeatedly altered by events he could not prevent. The impact on those around him was equally profound. His children became the emotional center of his existence, not as a public statement, but as a private truth. He adjusted his entire life to ensure stability for them, understanding that consistency was the one thing grief could not easily destroy. He became more involved in daily routines, more attentive to small details, more protective of their privacy. The world may have continued to associate him with fame and legacy, but inside the home, those identities mattered far less than presence. Public reaction to his quieter life was mixed. Some fans expressed concern, others admiration. Media narratives speculated endlessly, searching for hidden meanings in his reduced visibility. Was he retiring, fading, preparing for something final? The reality was less dramatic and more human. He was adapting. The losses he experienced had fundamentally altered his relationship with ambition. Achievement no longer functioned as validation. Survival did. Peace did. The ability to wake up without dread, to be emotionally available to his children, to exist without constantly performing an identity crafted decades earlier. Emotionally, the long-term effects of grief revealed themselves in moments rather than statements. He spoke about time with a gravity that suggested he understood its fragility intimately. He referenced mortality without fear, not as something looming, but as something already integrated into his worldview. This acceptance did not come from resignation, but from familiarity. He had already stood at the edge multiple times, and return changed each time. That experience stripped away illusions, leaving clarity in their place. What is most striking about this phase is the absence of anger. Many people confronted with repeated tragedy turn outward, searching for blame or meaning in conflict. He did neither. Instead, he internalized the experience, allowing it to reshape his values quietly. He did not reject his past, nor did he cling to it. He simply adjusted the weight he assigned to each part of his life. Fame became lighter. Family became heavier. The balance shifted permanently. These consequences form the foundation for understanding his later choices. They explain why stepping back felt not like loss, but like relief. Why simplifying his life did not diminish him, but steadied him. The tragedies did not destroy him, but they demanded a different way of living, one that prioritized depth over reach and presence over performance. This transformation is not immediately visible to the world, but it is unmistakable to those who know him well. It is the quiet aftermath of grief, the long echo that continues shaping every decision long after the initial pain has faded. There are parts of his life that never appeared in headlines, moments that unfolded far from cameras and premieres, where John Travolta was not a symbol of Hollywood resilience, but simply a man trying to hold himself together. In the years following the most public losses, what defined him most were not grand gestures or dramatic statements, but the quiet habits he developed to survive emotionally. Those closest to him speak of long pauses in conversation, of the way he would sometimes stop mid-sentence, as if choosing carefully which thoughts were safe to release. He became deeply attentive to the present moment, almost reverent toward ordinary routines, as if repetition itself offered protection against chaos. Morning rituals mattered. Shared meals mattered. Small traditions, repeated daily, became anchors in a world that had proven how easily everything else could disappear. Behind closed doors, grief did not move in a straight line. There were days of calm acceptance followed by nights of overwhelming memory. He revisited old photographs not to relive fame, but to reconnect with moments of togetherness that felt impossibly distant. Friends recall that he rarely spoke directly about pain, yet it was always present in the way he carried himself. His voice softened when speaking about family. His gaze lingered longer when listening to others. There was an emotional patience that came only from having endured too much to rush through feelings anymore. One of the least visible struggles was his relationship with solitude. For years, work had filled every empty space. Sets were crowded, schedules relentless, distractions constant. After stepping back, silence became unavoidable. At first, it was uncomfortable. Silence invited memory. It allowed loss to surface without interruption. Over time, however, he learned to coexist with it. Solitude transformed from threat into refuge. Flying played a central role in this shift. Alone in the cockpit, focused entirely on the mechanics of movement and precision, his mind found a rare clarity. There was no room for intrusive thought, only presence. Those hours in the air became a form of emotional regulation, a way to process grief without needing to articulate it. Another quiet reality was the way he learned to manage expectation, both his own and the world's. He no longer felt compelled to explain himself. Declined invitations went unanswered. Projects were turned down without justification. This was not arrogance, but boundary setting born from necessity. He understood that constantly explaining his choices reopened wounds that never fully closed. Protecting his emotional space meant allowing misunderstanding to exist. Letting people assume what they wanted became easier than correcting narratives that no longer mattered. In conversations with trusted friends, he occasionally reflected on how fame had complicated grief. Public sympathy arrived quickly, but faded just as fast. The world mourned in cycles, while his loss remained constant. That disconnect taught him an important lesson about emotional ownership. Pain cannot be outsourced. Healing could not be performed. It had to happen privately, at its own pace, without audience approval. This realization pushed him further inward, not out of isolation, but out of respect for the process. Parenthood during this period carried its own unspoken weight. He became acutely aware of how his emotional state influenced his children. Grief could not be allowed to dominate the household. Strength, therefore, was not about suppression, but about balance. He allowed sadness to exist without letting it define the atmosphere. Laughter was encouraged. Normalcy was protected. In doing so, he discovered a new form of purpose, one rooted not in achievement, but in emotional availability. Being present became an active practice, something he worked at daily. There were also moments of unexpected grace. Kindness from strangers who did not ask for photos. Conversations with people who spoke to him not as a legend, but as a fellow human navigating loss. These interactions reminded him that identity could exist beyond celebrity, that connection did not require recognition. Those moments, though brief, reinforced his decision to live more quietly. They validated the belief that stepping back did not mean disappearing, but rather re-entering the world on more honest terms. What makes these unseen chapters so significant is that they reveal the internal labor behind his public choices. Stepping away was not an impulsive reaction, but the result of years spent recalibrating what life could realistically ask of him. The sacrifices were not sudden, they were cumulative. Each loss taught him something about endurance. Each quiet day taught him something about peace. In this space between fame and absence, he discovered a version of himself that did not need constant affirmation to exist. That discovery, though rarely discussed, may be the most meaningful transformation of his life. As the noise of his earlier life faded, what remained for John Travolta was not regret, but reflection. Time had given him enough distance to see his journey not as a sequence of triumphs and losses, but as a single continuum shaped by choice, sacrifice, and endurance. The achievements that once defined him now sat beside the pain that reshaped him, neither canceling the other out. Fame had brought opportunity and identity, but it had also amplified vulnerability. Grief had taken much, yet it had clarified what truly mattered. In this later chapter, he no longer separated success from suffering. He understood that they were intertwined, each giving meaning to the other. When he looked back on his career, it was not individual roles that carried the most weight, but the moments of connection they created. He recognized that audiences did not respond to perfection, but to honesty. The characters that endured were those infused with emotional truth, drawn from his own sensitivity and lived experience. That awareness shaped how he thought about legacy. He did not view it as a list of accomplishments or awards, but as the emotional imprint left behind, the feeling people carried long after the screen went dark. His work mattered not because it was celebrated, but because it resonated. Equally important was how his personal life redefined his understanding of strength. For years, strength had meant resilience through productivity, continuing despite pain, maintaining momentum at all costs. Over time, that definition collapsed. Real strength revealed itself in restraint, in knowing when to stop, when to protect, when to choose presence over persistence. He learned that stepping back did not erase value. It preserved it. This shift challenged the culture that had elevated him, a culture that often equates worth with visibility. By choosing a quieter existence, he offered a subtle counter-narrative, one that suggested fulfillment does not require constant performance. Family became the core of his legacy in ways that fame never could. He measured success not by external recognition, but by the stability he provided, the memories he protected, the emotional safety he cultivated for those closest to him. These contributions would never appear on a resume, yet they carried a permanence that awards could not match. In nurturing that space, he reclaimed agency over a life that had often been shaped by external demand. His reflections on mortality were not marked by fear, but by realism. Having confronted loss repeatedly, death no longer felt abstract. It felt familiar, integrated into his worldview. This familiarity did not diminish his appreciation for life, it deepened it. Moments gained value precisely because they were finite. Time became something to be honored, not filled. That perspective influenced how he approached everything, from work to relationships to solitude. Each decision was filtered through a simple question. Does this add meaning, or does it take it away? In this reflective phase, he also acknowledged the cost of the path he had chosen. Early fame had arrived before emotional maturity, demanding adaptation under extreme pressure. Mistakes were made, opportunities missed, identities blurred. He did not romanticize these aspects, nor did he dwell on them. Acceptance replaced analysis. The past became something to integrate rather than correct. This acceptance freed him from the need to justify or explain, allowing him to live more fully in the present. What emerges from these reflections is a legacy defined not by scale, but by depth. He will be remembered as an icon of movement, sound, and cultural influence, but also as an example of how vulnerability can coexist with success. His life illustrates that greatness is not immunity from pain, and that survival often requires redefining what winning looks like. In choosing introspection over expansion, he modeled a different kind of fulfillment, one rooted in alignment rather than ambition. This legacy may not be immediately visible, but it endures quietly, much like the man himself in this stage of life. It exists in the emotional honesty of his performances, in the boundaries he set, in the love he protected. It exists in the understanding that life does not ask us to remain the same forever, but to evolve in response to what we endure. That evolution, shaped by loss and guided by reflection, stands as the most enduring testament to who he has become. As his story reaches its quietest point, there is no dramatic farewell, no final speech designed to be remembered, only a gradual settling into a life that no longer needs to prove itself. For John Travolta, the ending of this journey does not feel like closure in the traditional sense. It feels more like a pause held gently, a space where meaning is no longer extracted from achievement, but from presence. The man who once defined eras of popular culture now measures his days in far smaller units, moments that do not demand witnesses. In that choice lies a truth that many struggle to accept, that the most significant chapters of a life are often the least visible. What remains when the spotlight dims is not emptiness, but intention. Every step back he has taken has been deliberate, shaped by years of learning what loss demands and what survival requires. This final phase is not about disappearance, but about reorientation. The world may still associate him with iconic images, unforgettable movements, and roles etched into cultural memory, yet his own sense of identity has shifted elsewhere. He has become someone who values continuity over novelty, depth over reach, and authenticity over applause. The legacy he leaves behind is therefore not confined to film history, but embedded in a quieter philosophy about how to live after everything familiar has been taken away. There is something profoundly human in the way his journey concludes. It resists spectacle. It refuses easy interpretation. Some will see withdrawal, others will see peace. Both interpretations miss the subtlety of what is actually happening. He is not leaving life behind. He is engaging with it on terms that honor what he has endured. Grief has not vanished, but it no longer dominates. It exists alongside gratitude, memory alongside motion. This balance did not arrive quickly or effortlessly. It was earned through years of internal negotiation, through learning how to carry loss without letting it consume every remaining joy. In this closing chapter, he does not ask to be understood. He does not attempt to shape the narrative. He allows ambiguity to exist, accepting that not every decision needs explanation. That acceptance marks a final evolution from the boy who once needed to be seen to the man who now understands the power of being unseen. It is a transformation that challenges the very foundation of celebrity culture, which often equates relevance with constant exposure. His life quietly argues that relevance can also be found in restraint. For those who have followed his journey, this ending invites reflection rather than conclusion. It raises questions about what success truly means and how much of ourselves we are willing to sacrifice in pursuit of it. It asks whether legacy is something we build publicly or something we protect privately. His choices suggest that legacy is not only what remains after we are gone, but how we choose to live once we understand what cannot be replaced. As the story settles, what lingers most is not sadness, but a sense of calm shaped by hard-won clarity. He has faced loss repeatedly and chosen not to harden. He has known fame intimately and chosen not to cling to it. In doing so, he offers a rare example of what it looks like to age with intention in a world that fears stillness. This is not a goodbye meant to close a door on the past, but one that gently opens space for a future defined on his own terms. And perhaps that is the final lesson embedded in his journey. That life does not demand constant reinvention, only honest adjustment. That stepping back can be an act of strength rather than surrender. That even in silence, a life can speak volumes. His story does not end with an exclamation point, but with an open pause, leaving those who listen to decide what meaning they will carry forward from it.